Amen, Brother Art. Thank you so much. I'm Ken Blackwell, Senior Fellow for Family Empowerment at the Family Research Council. I'm former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and I've held a variety of public offices throughout my 40-year career. We have a distinguished panel of experts on national security issues and the Middle East. We have Frank Gaffney, who is immediately to my left, and we have Kamal Salim, who is next to Frank. The approach that I take to moderating panels is I am the clock manager. One of the ways that I passed on the responsibility to my colleagues for introducing themselves to you is that way I know that they will say what they want you to know about them and their background that gives you a deeper appreciation of the perspectives that they share with you. My job is to manage the clock. I will have some remarks about the Middle East after Kamal speaks. I will focus my remarks on Iran and the nuclear issues that concern the Middle East and that particular country. So I'm going to turn it over to Frank to introduce himself, to kick off this discussion on Israel and the Middle East, and let Frank know, as well as Kamal, that we will give each 15 minutes to get their introduction and their opening comments. Frank?
Ken, thank you very much. I'm going to start off by saying to those of you who were in the previous session, Kamal and I are going to make this a regular pas de deux from here on out. But I apparently confused a lot of you. If you were here, I apologize for that. If you haven't, let me try to clarify. I mentioned that a subject that we'll be touching on, I know again, in this panel, is being addressed in a course that we are going to roll out on Tuesday. That evidently got across, but most people, I guess, don't know what I mean by that, so let me be a little bit more specific. If you go to the website MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com on Tuesday, you will be able to download there a series of 10 videos that will walk you through the various aspects of the problem that we talked about at length in the earlier program. You can do it at your convenience. We're hopeful that they will be user-friendly enough that you'll work your way through the entire program, but you can do it at your leisure by going to the MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. If you have any further questions about it, see me afterwards. My name is Frank Gaffney. I am the president of an organization called the Center for Security Policy, which has produced that course and was the sponsor of the book that we talked about earlier, Sharia, the Threat to America. I have run the center for 24 years now, pretty much from the time I left the Defense Department, where I worked for President Reagan for 4.5 years. Prior to that, I was on the Capitol Hill working for Senator John Tower of Texas on the professional staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and before that, for about 5 years, for Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, Democrat of Washington. Most of what I've learned on this subject, I've learned from on-the-job experience, specifically that with Senator Jackson, and in the Pentagon, though I did not have responsibility for the Middle East, I did have a chance to work with those who were involved in trying to secure it at that time. Sadly, in the space of the 36 years or so that I've been working in one or the other of these capacities, and I think it's fair to say really going back to the founding of the State of Israel, there's never been a more dangerous time for the Jewish state than there is at the moment. And I'm just going to tick off why I think that's so very quickly, and then we'll get into the Q&A, I hope, after Kamal and Ken speak. Just look at what's happening in the neighborhood. The government that is perhaps the most favored by President Obama in the region is Turkey. Turkey is run by an Islamist regime that has made no secret of its ambitions to extend its influence into the Middle East in a way that it really hasn't, I would argue, since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. You have people actively talking about, not just in Turkey, but elsewhere, of course, restoring the caliphate, the Ottoman, experience. Not clear that anybody else shares that idea of having the Turks back, but there certainly is a lot of interest in re-Islamicizing the parts of the Middle East that have been relatively secular and making even more virulently jihadist those parts, particularly the kingdoms, that have to varying degrees been already pretty sympathetic to or aligned with these guys. Turkey is a serious problem, not least because it's a NATO ally. It is a country we have helped arm. It has a large and quite formidable military that previously, until basically Erdogan came to power, Recep Erdogan, the prime minister, was a force for good, both in Turkey and in that part of the world, but is now increasingly being purged and redirected to fall into line with the Islamic direction of the prime minister. Then there's Egypt. As you may have noticed, it's now under new management, the Muslim Brotherhood, to be specific. If you were with us in the earlier program, you will appreciate that that's not a good thing. Not for Israel, not for the people of Egypt, not for the rest of the neighborhood, and most certainly not for us. Egypt, of course, is one of the most strategically important countries in that part of the world, the largest Arab population, a country that sits astride the strategic Suez Canal, through which about, I think, 10% of the world's oil flows each day. And not least, it's the country, of course, that has a peace treaty with Israel that changed completely the complexion of the Middle East from what was the past practice prior to the 1979 Camp David Accords, namely one in which, at any given moment, it would be game on for war against Israel. With Egypt out of that lineup, that ceased to be the case. It's getting back in the lineup. You will see that in a number of different places. You have, of course, the brothers talking openly about vitiating the Camp David Accords. You have them now openly aiding and abetting Hamas in the Gaza Strip. You have Sinai, the demilitarized Sinai, now being used again by Hamas and Al-Qaeda and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others to attack Israel with missiles and terrorist attacks. Libya, also now under new management, an oil-rich state, has, as a practical matter, been turned over to the jihadists. Muslim Brotherhood at best, Al-Qaeda at worst. The arms that Muammar Gaddafi had amassed are now all over the place, including things like surface-to-air missiles and other advanced weaponry. Some of it has migrated into the hands of folks like the Sudanese, who are now using it to start up the war against the Christians and animists in the south all over again. Lebanon now is under the control of Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. Kamal can speak much more authoritatively about this than I, but suffice it to say it's an Iranian proxy, one of the other states on the borders of Israel. Hezbollah is estimated to have as many as 10,000 missiles and rockets within striking distance of Israel. We have, I mentioned Hamas a moment ago now, thanks in part to the Egyptian meddling, a unity government in the so-called Palestinian community. This would bring Hamas into a position to exercise some influence and probably ultimately take over in the West Bank, not just the Gaza Strip. Hamas, of course, also a proxy for Iran in terror and attacks against Israel, some of which are now a kind of almost everyday occurrence as rockets are rained down on civilian populations in Israel, some of which are being defended by missile defenses, I'm happy to say, some of which are being successfully attacked, all of which are being terrorized. Then there's Syria, You probably have been following some of the ups and downs of that story. The Bashar Assad regime is engaged in brutal repression of its people. The Islamists are seeking to overthrow it. Any Democrats or secular forces that are to be found there are almost certainly going to be crushed between the two. The smart money, I suspect, is on the Islamists, though the Iranians are very serious about trying to perpetuate the regime of Assad because he is their guy. But frankly, either way, it's not going to be very good for Israel, because the Syrian neighboring nation is going to be violent and is probably going to become, once again, aggressive against Israel, especially if that correlation of forces that I was talking about a moment ago, of Egypt back in the lineup, creates the expectation that the Islamists can go at Israel once more. Something they've aspired to do from the beginning of the State of Israel, but have been unable to do for now 35-odd years. Then there's Iraq, a nation that until recently we had helped stabilize, if not in an utterly satisfactory condition, at least seemed to have eliminated a very serious threat in Saddam Hussein and prevented something worse from emerging. I'm afraid now that we've bailed out that something worse will emerge. Most likely, again, another Iranian client state. Certainly the Iranians are exercising a lot of influence there right now. Well, and that brings us to Iran. I know Ken is going to talk about it, so I'll give it short shrift, except to say that it's involved in a number of the places, as I've mentioned, not simply in supporting terror and terrorist organizations and terror-sponsoring regimes, but also in destabilizing the region and seeking to increase its influence over it. And then, of course, there's the bomb. It's coming. We are not stopping it. The only possible impediment is that Israel will act to slow it down. But unfortunately, as they are very clear about, their window for doing that is rapidly closing. And when you look at the government of the United States now engaged in a new, seemingly open-ended round of negotiations, the next convening of which will be May 29th, I think, you realize that the Obama administration is at best doing nothing helpful, and at worst is very much undermining Israel. And this is really the key point that I guess I want to leave you with. If all of that weren't bad enough in terms of the neighborhood and the dynamics that we are seeing emerge there and the correlation of forces that is emerging from them, you do have this other problem. And that is, I think, to a degree unprecedented since the founding of the Jewish state. There is daylight between the United States and Israel. Daylight that is unmistakably perceived by Israel's enemies as a window of opportunity, a chance to act on that abiding ambition to rid the world, certainly their neighborhood, of the Jewish occupiers, the infidels. And to the extent that we are, as a result of encouraging this perception, actually inviting an attack by one or more of these parties, it is, I'm afraid, obviously a terrible thing for Israel, but I believe it is a terrible thing for this country as well. Because quite apart from whatever sentiment we might have about the Jews or about the Holy Land or about the moral imperatives of ensuring that never again is not simply empty rhetoric, Israel is in the front lines of what I think of as the war for the free world. It is an impediment to those who wish to destroy us getting to us. And nothing would do more to embolden them and encourage them than for us to persist in what we're doing now to surrender or otherwise assist the destruction of the Jewish state. So, as we work to awaken one another to some of the really important challenges of our time, For reasons that we talked about in the previous panel, among others, I think this is an area and an issue and a moment when we must awaken our countrymen to what is happening to friends and allies and important sources of strength for us at a dangerous time, namely our friends in Israel. And I thank you for giving me a chance to talk with you about it.
My name is Kamal Salim. My story is a little bit different than Frank's. I was born in the Mideast to a Muslim Sunni family. We are the majority of Islam. We are the majority of them by almost 90%, if not more. You know, so we're coming to a place where we learned all alone that the days of Islam will not come about. The days of Islam will not come about, and meaning Islam being superior over everything, until the Muslim arise and fight whom? Specifically the Jews. And in the promise that Allah gave the Muslims, that even the tree and a rock will cry out, Abdullah, Muslim, behind me an infidel, behind me a Jew, come and behead him. You know, just chop his head off. So with this, in that place, when I was a young lad, I was learning from my mother. My mother said to me, my son, if you kill a Jew, your hand will light up before the throne of Allah. And a host of heaven will celebrate what you did against the Jewish people. There's a promise in the Quran was given to us from my childhood. It says, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءً عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. Those who died for the sake of Allah, they are not dead, but they are alive and prospering. Why? Because they are martyrs. What makes them martyr is by their blood. Their blood, what makes them holy. So what happened is, but the holiness of their blood is not by killing themselves, but killing others with their blood. And at least 10 people or more. So the 9/11 people are leaders. With that in mind, I grew up from my mother to take my first commission to be a radical Muslim. From there, I became part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I was learning how to infiltrate American and Western civilization, specifically America, how to obtain the American citizenship, how to marry American women, how to turn the Constitution against its people. We were learning from the Muslim Brotherhood in the mosques in Beirut. This is what we were learning. And from there, we want to learn, because now the power of Islam is not in the Quran, it is the power of the sword. So we trained under Yasser Arafat, and from there I met every ridiculous leaders, infamous leaders of Mideast, that they became, allowing terrorism to go to higher level. So now my resume in Mideast is one of the best resumes. You know, he worked for Reagan, I worked for all of them. You know, we're the good guys. Why? Because we are the freedom fighters. Because when we die, we are not celebrating getting our families to go to heaven, to paradise, because of our blood. The first drop of our blood will allow 70 of our family to go without judgment to heaven. The second one, we get 72 versions. With every version, we get 72 versions. I was a young man, and I said to my dad, I said, Dad, you have a problem with my mom, and she's 1. How are you going to handle 72 with 72? A lot of them. But what happened, the agenda that's been given to us is totally different than any other thing. Today, what we're dealing with, America could not go without Israel. Israel is state of our states. We could not do, the word of God says, I will bless those who will bless them, and I will curse those who curse them. We're coming to the place where we must stand for Israel, because they are our brothers. Just as I read in the book of Ephesians earlier today, Ephesians 2 and 14, God joined the Jews and the Gentile who became Christian to be one citizen, one people, to serve His glory. So we are one citizen in God. That's what the Bible said. So therefore what happened is, today we are not fighting just for Israel. We are fighting for God Himself for these issues. In Psalms 83, the book of Psalms, it maps what's going to happen this next season. Psalms 83 says the 10 nations of Islam will arise all together. He called them the Hagarite, the Ishmaelite, the Edomite, the Assyrian, the Philistine, and the Gibel, and all those areas. This is the surrounding area of Israel. This is not Armageddon. This is going to happen right now. But God is going to arise them just like he aroused Pharaoh against Israel, against the Israelite when they left Egypt. But God is going to equip Israel with glory and power, I believe. Today, my cousin in Lebanon, he's the Grand Mufti. He's the Holy of Holies. He's the Grand Imam. He's the one who declares fatwa, which is judgment. And so therefore, they really love me to death over there because I'm talking about their issues. Today, we are not fighting these people that they are, just want to destroy Israel, but they want to destroy, we were told that one day the kuffah that they wear on their head will be floating by the millions all over the Mediterranean Sea because we're going to push them to the water. This is the dream that we celebrated and we cried out, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. We come into a place, we've seen the migration of the Jewish people from Europe. They're migrating from France. In Tel Aviv today, and Jaffa, you find out the first language is French now because the French Jews are migrating out of Europe, France. And then the European Jews start migrating. It's scary what's happening. And Hezbollah and Syria, Bashar al-Assad said to the United Nations and declared to European, he said, if you will invade Syria, he have over 6,000 Scuddies. These are new rockets. They are so unique rockets. These rockets can go 300 miles in a distance. They're about 12 miles in closeness. And they can carry chemical payloads. He said the minute you attack Syria, Hezbollah and Syria will loose all those rockets upon Israel overnight. So we're coming to the place Syria is becoming a problem as Turkey is becoming a problem. And hopefully we'll cover that in a question and answer. I don't want to reveal a lot of this. But we're coming today that Israel is in big, big trouble. And America, specifically the Church of America, is their first allies. And we must be there for them.
Thank you. Come on. Let me just focus on Iran for a second. Frank talked about their developing nuclear capability in terms of weaponry. Here is what national intelligence estimates say, that we probably have a window of about 18 months before they have fulfilled their capability challenge. There are two roads that we go down. Either they get the nuclear weapons or someone takes military action. Frank has indicated that Israel could do it, we could do it, or we could do it together. Israel is right at the point of danger. So here are the actions that are before us. We can attack or use strategic airstrikes on the nuclear weapon facilities, their reactors, or their uranium mines. Or there could be strategic action of taking out human assets that have that scientific knowledge that accelerates their being a nuclear power, the scientists. Point in fact, there have been 32 International Atomic Energy Agency reports on Iran's nuclear program. This has led to 5 UN resolutions for Iran to freeze its enrichment efforts. In all 5 cases, Iran has ignored the resolutions. At the end of the day, we are in a race against technology, science, and folks who would do both Israel and the United States of America harm. Ironically, in the neighborhood, in quiet, many of the Arab states have no interest in Iran developing that capability because of their aggressiveness in the neighborhood and because of history. I would suggest to you that a nuclear Iran becomes the single most serious threat to Israel and to worldwide stability and the hope and promise of democracy and free markets. Here's the point that I want to make about Egypt because a lot of demographics are not even within the grasp and control of the forces that are in play in these countries, and in this case, in Egypt. Egypt has a population demographic that is alarming to both us and to the Muslim Brotherhood. 60% of Egypt's population is under the age of 26, which means that we're probably not the only ones with an 18-month window. I would think that the Muslim Brotherhood is probably facing an 18-month to 2-year window before the anxiety and anger and desires of that population turns on them for being incapable of producing the prosperity, the jobs, and opportunities. So there's nothing in their program that can get their economy growing again, and I think that demographic is beyond their control and is another one of the real threats to destabilization in that neighborhood. With those sort of summary remarks about Egypt and Iran, we throw it open for about 30 minutes of questions and answers. Let's be mindful that we want to get as many questions as we possibly can, and so we would ask you to have a question and to keep it as succinct as possible as we have the microphones go around the room. Right here is the first gentleman in the back with the black shirt on. Your hand is up. Let's see if we can. Is there a mic? Do we have a?
Well, I'm pretty loud.
Oh, okay.
In my studies in Bible reading and watching current events, I have come to the conclusion that Islam, while they call America great, simply follow Satan, and that Allah, in reality, is the God of this world, who the Bible tells us is Lucifer. And I believe that this is all a build-up to that end-time battle between God's people and a prophet of Islam and the people of Satan. I'd like to hear what y'all think about that.
Well, read Psalms 83. That's homework for all of y'all. And it speaks about specifically what we're coming about. But as far as what's happening, Iran is trying to usher what's called Muhammad Abdullah al-Mahdi. Al-Mahdi, he is the one who will destroy Judaism and Christianity in the whole world and bring about Islamization. But before what we talked about the doctrines, it says, Muhammad says in the hadith out of Sharia law, he said the days of Islam will not come about until the Muslim arise and fight. They believe that the days will be war. You know, that's what we were taught from our childhood, that we usher chaos upon the earth for the Muhammad al-Mahdi to arise to his place. And when he arises to his place, he will destroy all non-Muslims. So therefore, we're coming to the place we believe in that wholeheartedly. The Sunni have one and the Shia has one, the Mahdi. But the Mahdi of Iran, he's already risen, and they found him in a well, and he's been there for many years in the well. And when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the mayor in Iran, he made a highway from the well all the way to Tehran, which is one day he will come and he'll take his rightful place where the Khomeinis are. These are all truth. You know, this is like, it sounds like a book, but this is what we believed in all alone. And in order for this to happen, he has to have a power to use. I believe, you know, although that they are coming to destroy Israel and to destroy the West, I believe God has a plan. And that plan is a grand plan. Because Elam is mentioned in the Bible that God will destroy Elam by Israel. When Israel hit Elam, which is Iran, we're going to see Iran, you know, nuclear power, something happen underground, and we're going to see massive destruction. I believe that just according to the Second Chronicle and many other books, that God will turn the enemy against each other before Israel turn upon them all. I think this is coming to the place. We can look at it in the secular understanding, and it's perfect, it's all right. But let's look at God of heaven and earth, which is the spiritual perspective. And that's another perfection that we could not leave out of the Bible. That was written 3,000 years ago. That God spoke about this that will happen today.
There's definitely a clash of worldviews. Let me ask Frank not to comment on that subject, but one of the things about managing the clock that I can do is to ask the panelists if there's anything that they want to follow up on that we didn't cover in our brief remarks. Frank.
Well, I guess in a way it ties into this larger question of what are we up against. There's a component of this Iranian threat that Ken and I both touched on that I think you all need to be thinking about as well. President Mohammed Ahmadinejad of Iran has notoriously, repeatedly talked about wiping Israel off the map. I'm sure you're aware of that. He has made almost as frequently another comment that should really be getting a lot more attention here than it has, to the effect that a world without America is not only desirable, it's achievable. And why that's of concern is not just simply that it's an exhortation to the masses that are endlessly shouting Allahu Akbar, yes, but also death to America. But because what the Iranians have been doing as part of this nuclear weapons program that they're pursuing, and the means by which it can be delivered once they have a nuclear bomb, is they've been putting into place all of the component parts of what you would optimally want to inflict on a country like this what has been described as a catastrophic attack. I don't know if you've heard of this phenomenon, but the very short form of it is if you were to take a ballistic missile, perhaps even a relatively short-range one, launched off of a ship, and fire it into the heavens high over more or less the center of the United States, and detonate that nuclear payload outside the atmosphere, say above Omaha, what you would create is not the blast and the, thermal effects, because it's outside the atmosphere. You would create intense electromagnetic energy, something called electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. And the trouble with that is that if things like the electrical grid or electronic components on Earth within line of sight of that blast have not been shielded against this intense burst of energy, it actually comes in 3 waves, but it has such a devastating impact that it will assuredly damage and quite possibly destroy things like transformers that are the backbone of our electrical grid. So to get your head around what I'm describing, you have occasionally hurricanes in this part of the world, I know, but one that really remains, very much on our minds, I think, is Katrina. And what went down after Katrina hit and took out the electrical grid in that part of the country was a ripple effect on all of the other infrastructures that basically support life in 21st century America. Think about it. When the lights go off, it gets pretty uncomfortable. And here, you worry about air conditioning, I guess. Up where I'm from, you can freeze to death, or starve to death, or not have clean water, or medication, or financial transactions, or communications, or transportation. All of that goes away in a 21st century society like ours without electricity, especially without it for a year or 5, which it might take to replace those transformers because we don't make them. And it takes a long time to get them on a good day. So at the risk of further frightening the hell out of you, if I can use that expression in this audience, this is something that we could do something about. The good news is that at the very least, we know how to harden those transformers against this kind of effect. And there's another reason for doing it, quite apart from what the Iranians seem to be preparing for in the way of bringing about a world without America. A world that would presumably create conditions under which the Mahdi would return. A world in which there may also be an attack on Israel. A world in which people who, are driven by Lucifer or whatever else are pushing forward with a very, very alarming agenda. Set all that aside. Let's just say none of it's a problem. Unfortunately, that's not so, but let's just say for the purpose of discussion, there is a problem that is happening right now that you may be aware of, and that is that there is a period in the sun's cycle of intense solar flaring. And when that happens, the sun lets loose electromagnetic pulses. So if we happen to be in the line of sight of one of those electromagnetic storms on the surface of the Earth, we're going to get this. So in short, folks, it is criminally, recklessly irresponsible for the government of the United States not to be doing everything it can to shield our electrical grid and core infrastructures against either a, well, as they like to say at the Homeland Security Department, man-caused disaster or a naturally occurring one. So thank you for the time to take that in.
Yes, my name is Dr. Reyes. You know, from all the threat, danger that you presented, for me, you know, the worst thing is the way this administration has handled Israel. You know, because, as you said, they having the first time in any administration that they vote in the United Nations against Israel. You know, and that is something to think about. You know, because I believe if this administration or the United States go against Israel, the United States is the one that is going to suffer. Because I believe God has a protection over Israel, that no Muslim, no atomic bomb, anything can destroy it, because it's God's word. You know, but I believe we need to do our part. But you see, President Truman in November 30 was the first man, the first president that put the signature to create the State of Israel in the United Nations. And all the Latin countries followed because of the influence of the United States in that time. You know, when came Yom Kippur War, was President Nixon. You know, because Israel was in a danger, that Golda Meir called President Nixon at 3 o'clock to the red telephone and tell President, if the United States don't do nothing, I believe Israel can disappear. Because, you know, Egypt had come from the south, Syria from the north. Everybody was, you know, Yom Kippur. Israel was not prepared. But I believe, you know, the United States moved. President Nixon, even in the middle of Watergate, moved to any country in Europe, one for the American planes to land in Europe, because they are all for Arab. You know, the European are the United Nations. Almost everybody is against Israel. But I believe the God of Israel is great enough, and what we need is to revive the church. And I believe it's going to take a revival, because I believe Ezekiel 38 is going to be fulfilled, and the glory of the God is going to come when they attack Israel. God is going to intervene.
Thank you. Look, we are often told we should focus on the economy and domestic politics. I would hope that what you are hearing today would help you to focus, you know, on things that can gravely impact our quality of life and our prosperity and the democracy that we enjoy. Let's make sure that that we have a question, even though that statement answered a question. In Psalms 11, verse 3, the question is asked, if the foundation be destroyed, what shall the righteous do? And so you didn't ask the question, but you answered that question. Thank you very much. Right here. Yes, ma'am.
I have a simple question. Are we, the United States, Israel's only ally? In fact, does America have any allies in dealing with the Middle East question and Israel? It seems we stand alone, and I'm really disconcerted and confused about what U.S. can do if Israel is attacked, because I don't think we have any allies. It appears that Europe is pretty much Islamicized.
Well, you know, hopefully you heard the question, and as who else stands with us in support of Israel? And I think some context of what Frank has asked is how strongly under the Obama administration is the tie between the U.S. and Israel. Look, within the geopolitical gymnastics that take place within the United Nations, and most notably within the Security Council, consistently the French, the Chinese, and the Russians are not friends of Israel. And they are all too often supporters or at least blockers for the Islamist countries and governments that we have outlined and talked about today. Frank.
Thank you for the question. It's a very important one. As I intimated in my comment, or I guess more or less said, I think that this president has gone to extraordinary lengths to distance the United States from Israel. Let me tell you just one anecdote from the course that I mentioned. I did mention it, didn't I? Okay. MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. This is a story that I kind of had a providential encounter with a state senator from South Dakota who told me that it had happened to him. You remember the president has now made two, for want of a better term, Muslim outreach addresses. One in Cairo in 2009, one at the State Department in Washington in May of this year. And the second of those was the event where he preempted, basically, Bibi Netanyahu's arrival the next day by saying that he thought that Israel must return to the pre-1967 borders. Remember that? Well, what I learned from this state senator, who just happened the night before, or the day, I guess, of the night before, to have been driving around the countryside of Minnesota with Keith Ellison, who you may know is the first Muslim member of Congress elected predominantly by a group of Somali refugees who have been transplanted in Minnesota. One of the states in the earlier program I mentioned has been kind of a dumping ground for unassimilable Sharia-adherent Muslims. But in the car was also another fellow by the name of Mohammed Majid. That may not be a name familiar to you. He's a very prominent figure in the Washington area because he runs the second most dangerous mosque in the United States, according to some. It's called the Adams Center, the All Dulles Area Muslim Society. He also happens to be the president of the largest Muslim Brotherhood Front organization in the United States, the Islamic Society of North America, or ISNA. Now, as they were driving around, this state senator by the name of Dan, I want to say Dan Lundgren, but I'm drawing a blank on it. It'll come to me. Lederman, thank you. Dan Lederman. He mentions that Majid, and I can't quite remember whether it was a text message or whether it was an email or whether it was a phone call, but Mohammed Majid gets summoned to the White House the night before the Muslim outreach speech because the president wants to go over it with him. So when you ask the question about where are we vis-a-vis Israel, when the president of the United States is taking personally, not just through subordinates, personally direction from one of the top Muslim Brotherhood operatives in the country, and comes up with a major departure from past American policy, which is to say that Israel must return to indefensible borders, that's an indicator of the problem. Now, as to your question about Europe, I think you're right. To a very substantial degree, the Western democracies of Europe have become sufficiently suborned by Islamists on the one hand and anti-Semites on the other that you find very few who are willing in any manner to be a reliable ally for Israel. In fact, the European Union representing them has become involved, along with the UN, Ken's old organization, and the United States and Russia, in what's known as the Quartet. And the Quartet is a diplomatic dance that is basically designed to squeeze Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. And when you see it playing out, you know, both in government and in the societies more generally, I think it's pretty clear that we are Israel's only real friend in the world. And if we are not, heaven help it.
Well, in traveling different places, I found out there's many supporters of Israel all over in pockets. So I refer to the Bible, you know, and I'm not coming, you know, against what he said. But the word of God in the Bible, if in the book of Ezekiel, he said he will raise 7 princes and 8 shepherds, and they will strike altogether Babylon, you know, and he will strike Babylon. But these guys are risen for the behalf of Israel. And where am I going with this? There are a lot of supporters of Israel, but today the transformation of Europe, what's taking place, if you travel down Europe, go down France or anywhere in Europe, you'll find now 7th century neighborhood all over the European continent, in France, in England, in Denmark, in Germany, every place you go, in Sweden. These places over there, Sharia has been established, and these become the blue collars, and they are the workforce, and they control everything. For example, in England, when the Islamists went on strike against the government, the trash was set there for weeks. Why? Because the blue collar were all Muslims, you know, the one they do trash. Now they run factories, they run butcher, places, factory, they run all those places. So they have dependency, and people are afraid of Muslims so much because they're dependent on them. In Italy, for example, when an Italian man is dying nowadays because they're not bringing children and not reproducing, their servant, their slave, the Muslims, are inheriting the family. You know, United States is only barely making the minimum, statistic, 0.2, 0.1, which is the minimum birth rate. You know, we are in jeopardy while Islam is at 8.1%. If they're exceeding the world birth, my family, we're 14 brothers and sisters, one mother. But ultimately, where I'm going with all this, it is the whole thing, really right now that the European world are choosing the Muslims and their wealth and their work power over Israel. And so therefore they're turning their back on Israel. Faisal Abdul Rauf, the Grand Imam for the Ground Zero mosques, when President Obama spoke in Egypt, in Cairo, when he spoke out of the Azhar al-Sharif, when Faisal Abdul Rauf was in Egypt, he said word for word, and you can hear it in Arabic, and our media are not putting it out there. He said, where was Obama before Faisal Abdul Rauf came to the United States of America? I wrote the speech for him. I wrote the speech for President Obama. So therefore, just look at the conversation that the French leader and our president had together. He said, how do you deal with the French people? They give me a headache. He said, tell me about them. I deal with them every day. So the Jew became a problem for them because they're choosing the Middle East, they're choosing the god of oil and the petrodollar, and they're lining up with the god of this world. You could not choose God and Mammon, and they're choosing Mammon against God. And so therefore today they are under the line of fire from God because they are rising against Israel. God will contend with the nation. He said in the book of Ezekiel, he said, I set my throne of judgment against those who come against my people. I believe that. I believe that because every mission that we did against Israel, they kicked our butt. We never succeeded with one mission. And I've done 3. I carried my best friend, and it's just a miracle that I lived. Just to tell you this story today, that you're in the right place.
Let me just tell you what we're going to do. We have a question here. There's a gentleman in the back with a black shirt on. Gets the last question.
Yes, we're actually streaming this live on the internet, and we actually have a viewer in Holland, the Netherlands, who has a question for the panel. And I know this man, and he's under a great deal of stress in Holland because they've let it go by and they've let it seen. I said they've let their country go, and the Islamists have pretty much taken over in Holland, and he's pretty upset about that. And he wants to know that his question to Frank Gaffney, or the panel, is now that the enemy threat doctrine is no longer in vogue in the United States Army, should we leave Afghanistan or should we leave all foreign countries now that the enemy threat doctrine is no longer in place in the United States?
I'm not sure I quite get
Well-
what he means by that. The enemy threat doctrine, I would argue, is Sharia. And if we're
Well,
not getting
he's
that
yeah.
threat doctrine, which
Yes.
is, I
You're
think,
not-
the
you're not allowed-
problem,
yes, you're not allowed to talk about that.
then the question is, can we possibly prevail in Afghanistan or, for that matter, any place else? I say this with a very heavy heart, particularly in the company of family members of SEAL Team 6 hero. One of the things that we did in the course is look at how the Defense Department has been profoundly undermined by this, as the questioner says, this failure to understand the nature of the enemy, and in fact, a strategy as well as policy that requires us to submit to that threat doctrine. You don't want to give offense. I mean, how many times have you heard we've apologized for somebody doing something to the Quran or to dead soldiers or Taliban or whomever? We're in a circumstance now where I'm afraid this strategy, such as it's called, the counterinsurgency strategy, and the doctrine that we're applying it under, is simply creating more casualties without effect. And I feel very reluctant in describing that publicly because the practical effect of that is to say, well, let's cut our losses and get out. What makes me very uneasy about that, I must say, is that I think the consequences of our doing so will be to bring more harm here. Because it goes back to what we talked about in the previous panel, and we've sort of touched on here too. Under this doctrine, as my colleague knows very well, when the infidel submits or behaves in a manner that is perceived as submissive, Sharia commands its adherents to redouble the effort, as the Quran says, to make them feel subdued. So it means simply pouring on more. And so when you hear people like the President, like the Secretary of Defense saying, or the commander of our forces in Afghanistan saying, we had to apologize profusely for burning those Qurans inadvertently to save lives. They've actually got it completely backwards. They are assuring that there will be more people killed because they are encouraging these guys to feel that they are in the process of winning. And that's what worries me, because it won't simply be our terrific men and women in uniform over there. It will be people here who will come up next.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I hate to be the last question, but in scope of today's conversation, and the hypothetical variables, possibilities in the months ahead, could you conceive of any possibilities that would affect the 2012 elections within the United States and alter the possibilities of our having a normal election?
One of the things that Ken didn't mention as a previous incarnation was as the Secretary of State of Ohio. So he knows a thing or two about elections. I guess I get the short straw. Let me just say, of course I can imagine circumstances. And going back to something Ken said, and I'm so glad he said it because it didn't come from me. The next time you hear somebody say, this election is going to be determined by the economy, ask them, do they think that the economy operates in isolation from what happens in the national security sphere? You know, let's just pick one scenario. Let's just say, for the purpose of discussion, that Israel decides to act in what remains of the closing window of opportunity it has to try to buy some time from the existential threat that Iran represents being visited upon it. Won't eliminate it, but buy some time. Well, the Iranians have said they'll close the Strait of Hormuz, which they certainly can, at least for a time. They've got the capacity to attack the oil fields in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else in the Gulf if they choose to. You could have, for that matter, the access to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal closed like that. In short, we could see immediately constriction of the oil supply and skyrocketing oil prices that make what we've been subjected to for the past couple of months look like the good old days. And that's just one example, an entirely plausible scenario. Could that translate into dislocation inside this country? Could that translate into civil disturbances? Could it give rise to a state of emergency, martial law? Well, maybe. Or maybe something else could. Maybe Hamas being unleashed or Hezbollah being unleashed. Pete King, the congressman who chairs the Homeland Security Committee, held a hearing a couple of weeks ago now and concluded that there were several hundred Hezbollah operatives inside the United States right now whose presumptive mission will be on orders to start attacking things. Will that give rise to a state of emergency, to a suspension of the election, to something that we can't, frankly, contemplate on the basis of our, very, very disciplined, democratic tradition in this country? Absolutely. I'm not making book on it, folks, but I just am here to tell you, you shouldn't bet against it.
The last
panelist
remarks will come from Kamal.
I just got a call last week, this week, I got a call from 4-star general active in our government. And they're putting an aftermath plan, in an event when several nuclear detonated in the United States, small head. What would happen and what's the best way to work with America. And they're trying to put strategy, what they're going to do with all this. And my play is, if you're a terrorist, how would you go about this today? This is a place for Selah. Things can't change because the executive order that our president just signed recently is to be in power in issues. One are, we have chaos in our streets. I was talking to Hezbollah group one time on the other side, and I didn't take it to heart. They said, we know where the weaknesses of the United States, and we can shut the United States of America overnight, even without destroying the United States. We can nuke Saudi Arabia. By destroying Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain, oil and UAE, just small bombs, on oil supplies. They said America will turn to third world country, if not Stone Age, overnight, because they're fully dependent on what? On energies and foreign oils that our current government is prohibiting for us to have. We're going somewhere, and there's strategy the world has, and we are going toward this, but you are not here by mistake. Everything that you heard today, write it on the tablet of your heart and do something about it. Because that can affect us today by one order, if we prayed or not, or if we did something about it or not. This is a call to action. This is a call to action.
Let's hear it for the panelists, please. Thank you so very much. God bless you all.